Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Leslie Eaton. I'm a senior editor at the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on criminal justice issues. We cover everything from police and prosecutors to courts and cops. We're based in New York, but I am based in half the time in New Orleans. Joining me is Cary Aspinwall, who covers the South for the Marshall Project.
Hi, Leslie.
Hey, Cary. Lea Skene, who's in Baton Rouge for The Advocate and the Times-Picayune.
Hey, Leslie.
And hi, Illica Mahajan, who is at the moment in Los Angeles, but is based in our New York headquarters.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi. So, Cary, I wanted to start off with you and ask you, what is life without parole? How is it different from what we all think of as life sentences? And why did you spend a year looking into life without parole?
So a lot of people think of life without parole as this thing that's been around forever, but it's actually a relatively recent modern construct. It really kind of took a new life in the late 80s and early 90s, kind of as a reaction to some of the deep crime waves that were going on. There was, the death penalty was sort of how we handled the most serious cases for homicides for many, many years. And then the death penalty had a moratorium in the 70s because of a Supreme Court ruling. And it was during that a moratorium that states started looking at, okay, what are some other ways we can lock people up forever? Because back in the day, until that moratorium, a lot of states, when they gave you a life sentence, even for murder, they would give you life, but it meant 15 to 20 years in most places. And
So
you were just out after that.
life. Huh?
No, it didn't mean, that was assumed, people didn't live as long back then. So that really was, if you were an adult, most of your practical adult life. And then some places left it what they called indeterminate. So it was like life to 99, or 99 to life, or 20 to life. And so parole boards were fairly common back then. And if you served 20 years, at the end of that 20-year period, then you would come up for parole. And the parole board would look at you and say, have you turned your life around? Have you become, an industrious citizen? Have you repented? They're always looking for a sign of repentance. So that was how a lot of people did get out. But then after you had that moratorium in the death penalty, a lot of states got rid of the death penalty. A lot of places instituted life without parole. It became very, very popular. And now it's kind of proliferated. But the thing is, we give life without parole for a lot of crimes that we never gave the death penalty for. It's expanded greatly. I think one of the things we found when we started looking at this is there's about 2,500 people still on death row in this country. Well, now there's 56,000 people serving life across the country. And that comes from very detailed data that the Sentencing Project has dived into, but you can kind of tell from federal data that's kept in the Bureau of Justice Statistics as well. It's just exploded. And so you can't just explain that by, oh, well, it's replaced the death penalty. It hasn't. It's far outpaced the death penalty. And now we have lots of different things that we give life without parole for.
Okay. So Illica, how do we know about all this? Where does the data come from and what does it tell us?
So there's a few different places where we got data from. So one was Louisiana State Department of Corrections handed over a bunch of data about every single person that is serving life without parole. And then the Sentencing Project also did a nationwide look back in 2019 to look at life without parole. And Louisiana constantly ranked amongst the worst, or it had the highest percentage of prisoners who were serving life without parole. It constantly ranked in the top 5, whether you considered the population of Louisiana or whether you considered the prisoner population of Louisiana.
Great. And when you looked at why people in Louisiana were serving life without parole, what did you find?
That more than half of the people who are serving life without parole in Louisiana are serving for second-degree murder, which is a little bit not as common as like in the other states. And so that was kind of interesting. And then the other thing was there's also, because of the 3 strikes law, there are many people who are, for example, serving life without parole for purse snatching or low-level offenses like that.
Wow. How is that possible? And what does that mean? How could you get life in prison until you die for purse snatching? Somebody want to jump in?
I can,
Yeah,
so
I
this
can
happens
jump
in a
in.
lot of states. Yeah, Leah can talk about this because she's really studied this issue in Louisiana, and Louisiana is not the only state that does this. You see these repeat offender laws. We'll get into more detail on that later, but a lot of states, Florida, Louisiana, a lot of these states that have the highest life without parole, they used like a combination of a 3 strikes you're out, or even sometimes 2 strikes you're out. Whereas if you had, say the person action came with an assault, you grabbed somebody's arm or you pulled a knife on them, well, then that's considered a, violent a felony in most places. So that bumps it up. And if you do it 3 times, I think Louisiana has a fairly harsh one, but Leah, can you explain? I know you've studied this a lot and you've written about a lot of things, including the second-degree murder, which is also what our story's about.
Right.
Yeah. So up until very recently in Louisiana, you could be sentenced to life without parole under the 3 strikes law for 3 completely nonviolent offenses. So including like drug possession, for example. As of now, you do have to have at least one violent offense. But yeah, like there was a case maybe a year or 2 ago where a man was sentenced to life without parole for stealing a pair of hedge clippers out of someone's tool shed. And he did end up getting out, but I think he served at least 30 or 40 years just for that.
For hedge clippers, that's
as his 3rd offense. Yeah.
Yeah. This is part of why we took this in-depth look at life without parole, because he would never have gotten the death penalty for that. So you can't simply say, oh, well, we've simply substituted the death penalty for life without parole and it's more humane. Well, that's, kind of a questionable use there. I think that's why that man eventually got out.
Well, what about second-degree murder, which sounds pretty bad, right?
Yeah. So Louisiana, as we found in our reporting, has this incredibly broad second-degree murder statute that includes even some accidental deaths. So like the case that we focused on with Tiffany Woods and her baby who died not long after Hurricane Katrina. She was convicted of second-degree murder because prosecutors argued she was guilty of cruelty to juveniles, which under the second-degree murder statute allows a conviction even in an accidental death if you're found guilty of that underlying felony offense. And what the data shows is that this law being so broad leads to a massive number of people sentenced to life without parole because it carries a mandatory life without parole sentence, which gives the judge no discretion to ensure that the punishment fits the crime. Well, it does give prosecutors a lot of discretion to decide whether they want to charge this as a murder case or potentially a neglect case, manslaughter, some sort of lesser charge. It gives prosecutors this massive amount of power, and then judges have very little room to sort of tamper that when they get to the sentencing phase.
So it's possible to be convicted of second-degree murder even if you didn't intend to kill anybody?
Yeah, that's one of the things that Tiffany's case really raises. One of the issues they even said, both the prosecutor and the judge when sentencing her, said, I don't think there's any evidence of intent, but under the law, we don't need it because you just have to have, I think the prosecutor who talked to the story said, it's that duty to protect their child that they failed on, that neglectful. So it's a form of child neglect that they decide is cruelty to juveniles. And under Louisiana statute, that's enough. So you didn't have to have any intent to harm, which Tiffany and her husband maintained they never did. They were going through, I guess we should give a little background on that in case you haven't read the story. Tiffany Woods this was her premature baby that was born about 2 months before Hurricane Katrina, Emmanuel Woods. And he was born a preemie. He was just over 3 pounds. He was real tiny. He had a lot of health issues. He was in the ICU, the neonatal ICU for about like 40 something days. They discharged him right before Hurricane Katrina, a couple of weeks before the hurricane leveled New Orleans and flooded it. She was let out of the hospital. The baby had tested positive for a genetic abnormality, but that screen can be a false positive sometimes. So they run more involved genetic testing. And what we found out through going through records and looking at the documents is that genetic testing never happened. At trial, they kind of made it sound like, well, they'd ruled it out completely. But the experts we talked to said you can't actually rule it out without really involved genetic testing that maps the genes and finds that abnormality. So that never happened, and we don't know, and we'll never know if the baby had it, because he was scheduled to have it the day that Hurricane Katrina actually hit New Orleans, and the family had fled to Shreveport with their other 3 older children that were still pretty young, and baby Emmanuel. And they were living in this Coliseum stadium shelter that was set up in Shreveport. Obviously, you can see it's like mattresses on the floor, pretty tough conditions, but they were safe and dry there. And one of the things that Tiffany told us is, if we'd intended to harm our child, why would we have fled with him? Why would we have gone to all the way? If we didn't care, we would have just stayed in New Orleans, because we would have been fine. So they fled with the babies and lived up there, and then they moved to a motel eventually, and then they live in this rental house. And the baby, from what we could tell and what they told us and what was in the records, he wasn't doing great. He was sleepy, he was very lethargic, and he would eat, but then he would throw up a lot. And so, one of the key things that happens in his death is the parents decide to switch him from formula, baby formula that had been taken since he got in the hospital, to organic cow's milk. And you're not supposed to give babies cow's milk until they're a year or older, but they didn't know that. They thought it might be better, or he might tolerate it better. That is a mistake that some people make, and pediatricians try to correct parents on it. But they didn't know, and the baby did worse, actually, and died of malnutrition. And, in their view, they were doing the right thing. The prosecutors and state decided it was the moment where they knew he wasn't doing well, they should have taken him to the doctor. And so that's sort of one of the core questions of the case. And I think the reader reaction has been, obviously this woman, made a bad decision, had a terrible time, was in these terrible circumstances, living far away from any friends and family and support. She didn't drive. But, was it really second degree murder is sort of the question, that I think the headline is, was it a crime? And Lea, I think you talked to an expert who said this maybe wouldn't even be a felony in another state.
Yeah, someone I spoke with who studies murder laws in different states said that he thought the standard was very low to prove that these parents were guilty of cruelty to juveniles, since it was a crime of neglect, essentially. So he said it's very unusual where you would see this crime of neglect rather than a crime of violence, what we think of as murder, that supports what is actually a murder conviction.
So the parents were convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Now what happens to them? And what happened to the rest of the family?
Yeah, so the parents have been serving life. Tiffany earned her bachelor's degree in prison, and she's working on her master's. We did, as part of our reporting process, we spoke with her 2 older sons. So the oldest one was 8 when this happened in 2005. And his younger brother, they're 24 and 21 years old now. The oldest one, John, he graduated from college recently and joined the Air Force. And the younger one, Troy John, he lives in Baton Rouge now, and he works at a church organization recording music, which is his passion. So her children are sort of miraculously finding their own paths and forming their own futures. One thing that they kept coming back to, though, is that they want their mom to be there. They want to be able to share this with her. And well, she said she's trying to set an example for them by continuing her education, even though she's in prison. They all just talked a lot about how they hope someday they'll be able to be together on the outside.
But so if I'm a taxpayer in the state of Louisiana, why do I care about this?
Well, it's awfully expensive to keep this many people. So there are about, I think it's 4,200 people serving life in Louisiana right now. And it's a massive cost to taxpayers, especially as my colleague John Zimmerman noted in his story, especially when they get to be older. So since life without parole sentencing in Louisiana really ramped up in the 70s, we're now seeing this very aging population of people who were sentenced then to serve life without parole. And when you look at the medical bills and other costs of keeping these people incarcerated, coupled with research that shows they essentially age out of crime, a lot of experts and advocates are raising questions about, like, is this really what we want to be doing as a state? Does this make financial and ethical sense to keep these people locked up literally until they die?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think that's one of the things that people really do ask is that, you know, the idea with the death penalty and the idea with life without parole is that these are people who are so dangerous and so depraved that you were supposed to lock them up forever because they were just a continuing threat to public safety. Well, it's hard to argue that for somebody like Tiffany Woods, whose other children remember her lovingly, they love her, they would like her out. She's never committed an actual violent crime. She's done well in her time behind bars in Louisiana corrections. She has other children who could have really used her in their lives. And it raises the question of, like, is this woman is not, if she's not a public safety threat, if there's no continuing threat, it is very expensive to incarcerate her, and it will get more expensive as she gets older. And the men that John wrote about in that story, I think we looked at this in Florida, basically we're running in some states because of the life without parole expansion, prisons that are nursing homes. I remember this was a different prison system as federal system in Florida, but during COVID, when we were interviewing families about their loved ones who were locked up in prison, this is Florida law, but there are literally entire wings of infirmed and elderly prisoners in Florida. And it's very expensive. And so Florida has this even more than like Louisiana's 3 strikes law. Florida has what's a 2 strikes law. And again, they have a pretty broad definition of what's a crime punishable by life. So when we went to Florida, we found that there were people who had committed 2 offenses, an armed robbery, but maybe they didn't shoot or actually hurt anybody. It was scary. And they got locked up for life at, like, sometimes 22, 21 years old. And then there was a case of a man named Mark Jones that we wrote about as well. And Mark was an alcoholic and he'd struggled in life and was really a low-level nonviolent criminal for the most part. But he walked up to a woman and tried to grab her keys one day in a supermarket parking lot, and he scared her. She was elderly. He's a big guy. But she was fine. She drove off. He didn't hurt her. It was an unsuccessful carjacking. And he got life for that in Florida. So the state of Florida is now, and he's been a model prisoner. He's turned his life around. He's actually the legal clerk at his prison now, law clerk. But he has no way of getting out. The way that this law is written, the way that the laws used to be in many states is that if you went to prison, I mean, we do call it the Department of Corrections in most states, because the idea used to be that you were supposed to rehabilitate people from their criminal life. And there's no mechanism in Florida. Like, they did away with parole in 1983 in Florida. And Louisiana has kind of the same principle, where just for these life punishable crimes, there is no option for a parole board. There's nothing to really let them out or look at their whole picture of their life. And what happens then is you take care of them until they die. And it's an expensive system. And that's why in looking at this, the top 5 states for life without parole were Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and California. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And actually half the life without parole population in the country is locked up in just those 5 states.
So I'm reading our, we don't have too many questions so far, but we do have a lot of comments, and some of them are, well, they did the crime, they should do the time. You talk to a lot of experts about this. What kinds of response, and I think you'd get some prosecutors would agree with that and other people who would disagree. What are the range of thoughts on it?
So one thing we heard from supporters of these life without parole sentences is that it really does provide solace to victims, to be able to say, like, this person will never be able to commit a crime in society ever again. And I think that peace of mind really is valuable. But then, of course, you have people on the other side, like we just discussed, the financial cost of keeping people incarcerated forever. And like Cary mentioned, are we trying to rehabilitate people in prisons, or are we just like throwing them in there and calling it a day? So I think that's kind of the 2 sides that we saw on that.
And I will say in the Florida stories that we did, there were very different reactions from the victims of the two crimes that we featured. The victim of the armed robbery from the man Dorian McElroy that we talked about, well, she was young, and he was young, and she thought he absolutely deserved life without parole. She was traumatized by this attack. Mark Jones, the man I mentioned, his elderly victim, said she thought it was absurd that he got life. She thought that maybe 10 years is what he's already served, that was sufficient for what he'd done. So it just, it kind of depends on your perspective. I think, there are prosecutors that believe this is the absolute only just punishment. And there are other ones who think, okay, a prosecutor in Florida actually told us, I wish they would bring back parole, because that's like the mechanism, the relief valve. So that was kind of an unusual thing to have a prosecutor say to me. I wasn't expecting it. I don't know. I mean, Lea, what's gone on in Louisiana? Because there were, like you said, the nonviolent offenders who were locked up forever in this law, and they got a second chance. There are now some juvenile cases. But I mean, is this even a discussion? Because I know Louisiana, obviously they're talking about the cost of incarceration and the cost of corrections there. But has anyone even talked about parole, or is that just completely off the table?
Yeah, so people are definitely talking about it. What we haven't seen is any widespread legislative change that would make any across the board opportunities for parole available to people sentenced to life and other long sentences. So one thing in Louisiana I don't know that we've mentioned is that virtually all life sentences mean life without parole, which is very different in most states. Like, you're sentenced to life, but you get parole eligibility after maybe 20 or 30 years. But yeah, so the approach they've taken so far seems to be, it's very piecemeal, and mostly based on the Supreme Court decision allowing parole eligibility for people sentenced to life as juveniles. That has had an impact in Louisiana, getting some people out. Otherwise, certain jurisdictions, like the DA in New Orleans, who was elected fairly recently, he has taken a lot of action, just going back and reconsidering some of these cases, looking at the sentences. But yeah, it's a very piecemeal approach. So we'll have to see whether this sort of slow moving approach to this will eventually lead to more widespread change across the board.
We did get an interesting question.
Racial disparities.
Saying, yes, particularly in Florida, but it's true in Louisiana.
Yeah, I can mention. I mean, we basically found the same ratio. Illica, if you want to talk about Louisiana, and then I can talk about Florida.
Yeah, I actually had also just pulled up Florida.
You got it.
So in Florida, it was disproportionately applied to Black men. They accounted for almost 75% of those that were serving time, but about 55% of all prisoners in the state were Black. And then,
so wait, 75% of people serving life without parole were Black, but only 55% of the people overall prisoners
were Black.
Black.
Yeah. And that is not the same as the actual proportion of folks in Florida who are Black. So it's far greater ratio than the Black population of Florida. So that's one of the things that sticks out when you look at the data.
What about in Louisiana?
Yeah, and then in Louisiana, it was, pulling it up just so that I don't misspeak.
It's essentially 3-1, right?
Yeah, it was like 2/3 of the population that is serving life without parole was Black, whereas it's, they are 1/3 of the population of the state.
So it is interesting when people say don't do the crime if you can't do the time. But when you look at it, people who are doing the crime, Black and white, they're not getting the same sentence. So that tells you you can do the same crime, but you may not get the same sentence. So why is that disparity exist if everybody's getting the same punishment?
Interesting. And when you talk to DAs, what do they say about that? When you talk to prosecutors?
They don't like to talk about that racial disparity too much. They know it exists and they feel bad. I mean, I think they would say that they always do what the law, they tend to go for what the law, the maximum, because that's their duty to the victims of crimes. And they would say that, well, the data doesn't show you everything because it doesn't reflect who took a plea deal, right? Like some of those folks took a plea deal and didn't get life. Right. So to really look at it, you kind of have to look at how the people were arrested and then when they were charged and who got who could pay for their lawyer, and maybe they got a better deal because they could afford an attorney, or maybe they got a public defender. I mean, that's one of the earliest stories that we did on this year, is that I think a lot of folks think, well, we could just give them the death penalty instead, or we could do this. Well, actually, if you get the death sentence, you have far better legal protections than you do if you get life without parole. You get like a team of attorneys, you get an investigator. And it's not to say that they're so well protected, but because of different case laws that have happened over the years, there are guarantees that are built into the system for defendants who are facing the death penalty. But you don't get that if you're facing life without parole. Those same guarantees aren't given to you. And we wrote about a woman in Texas who had been locked up. She just got out pre-trial. They haven't even had her trial yet, but she spent 2 years in jail, has not been convicted. Because she was given an appointed attorney who just didn't do a lot of work on her case. And now she got a different attorney. But it's really, a lot of the experts we look at say that prosecutors love life without parole because they don't have to deal with all the hassles that come with the death penalty. They know that death penalty is expensive. Those cases cost a lot more to prosecute. Juries can be a little squeamish in a lot of states about handing it out now. So a lot of times they'll just go for life without parole instead of death and not even bother with it because they don't have to, they can usually use it to get a plea deal. And that's kind of their goal sometimes. So I think it's, they don't like to talk about the racial disparities. And I know we asked a lawmaker in Florida about it. He said, well, the racial disparity for life is not any worse than it is just for the general prison population. So those disparities exist in large part throughout the system.
Well, here we have somebody asking about what percentage of life without parole people are paying a penalty for rejecting plea deals and going to trial. I don't know that we know the answer to that, do we?
We don't have data. Like, they don't keep that data in the way that we would like it. It's a great question. Some of the prosecutors in Florida that pushed back against our numbers said, well, this data doesn't show that. Well, you guys could keep that data if you wanted to, but you don't want to. What we do know is that some 90 to 97% of criminal cases in the justice system in the U.S. end in plea deals. People think of everything going to trial, go to court. Most cases never go to trial. They don't go to a courtroom. So you're not getting a trial in front of a jury as your peers. So there's a lot of criticism that the folks who got life without parole under these laws, the guy that stole hedge clippers, Tiffany, those folks, they were offered plea deals. And because they took the gamble, the risk of going to a trial and thinking, maybe the judge or jury will see it my way, maybe the justice system will work for me, then they get penalized for not taking the 20, 25 years the prosecutor offered. It's called basically the trial penalty. And it's something that a lot of groups have been very vocal in talking about, that you shouldn't be punished for executing or choosing to do what's your constitutional right to go to trial. You are innocent until proven guilty in this country. And, the plea deal system raises a lot of questions about how that works, because we know that people do actually take plea deals even if they didn't do it. There's data that shows that happens in a lot of cases because they just want to get out of jail and serve their time. And they don't want to get life. I mean, if you're facing 20 years, you're facing life. Some people are going to take a plea deal.
Somebody is asking about victims and victims' families and where they fit into this. We've talked a little bit about that, but what in your reporting, what did you hear from people?
I mentioned a little bit about the victims in Florida. It really just depends. In this case, the victims, in Tiffany Woods' case, the victim was her own baby. There were a lot of people who said, isn't losing your own child punishment enough? She has to live with that for the rest of her life. I mean, one of the saddest details of that story is that she asked Lea and I during our phone call with her, do you know where my baby is buried? The state of Louisiana had never told her. And in fact, they couldn't tell us where the baby was buried. He was cremated and they lost track of his remains. So, sometimes the people who are accused in the crime or convicted of the crime were victims themselves is important to think about. I think about crime victims' families all the time. Lea, what do you think? I mean, you do a lot of criminal justice reporting.
In Tiffany's case too, like from talking to her other kids, they really saw themselves also as victims of this, more victims of the sentence than the crime, but like having lost their parents to prison, like in some ways they saw their family as being the most impacted by what had happened. Not only did they lose their baby brother, they also grew up without their mom. And like they faced a lot of hardships throughout childhood. They bounced around from various foster homes and lived with different relatives, faced a lot of mental health challenges. So I think they would say there were like real impacts on their family, even though in this case, it's very unique in that the victim was her own child.
Right.
And I get asked that question a lot, Leslie, by prosecutors, by people I talk to, when we started talking about these stories. And one of the things I mentioned to you, and I don't write this in my stories because I'm writing about other people, but I had some extended family members in the state of Colorado who were murdered a couple years ago. And the man who murdered 3 of them, this was a triple homicide, he got life without parole because Colorado has abolished the death penalty. And at the time, they weren't even seeking it in most cases. And so I don't necessarily disagree with life without parole for violent crimes like that. But you have to look at that as being, my family being victimized by that and thinking, I don't know that a purse snatcher needs to serve the same amount of time. The guy that stole the hedge clippers, like, I'm a taxpayer too. I don't necessarily want to spend however, I think we calculated it for Florida, and it's over the cost of like one man's life, it's like $500,000 to incarcerate. So this is your tax dollars. It's really something to think about. I think a lot of different people will have different perspectives on that,
Sure.
just based on what's happened to them in life.
I have also heard this argument that a lot of people age out of crime, and so you're not necessarily protecting society by keeping somebody behind bars who committed a crime as a very young person. Is that something that you hear?
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of research. I know specifically in Louisiana, some of these people getting out who were sentenced to life maybe as juveniles or who achieved clemency. Research shows that after they've served 2 or 3 or 4 decades behind bars and reached like the age of 50 or higher, they pretty much don't. There's no record so far of these people committing another crime once they get out. So that's pretty limited research
it's
in
very
Louisiana.
rare or
But
unusual.
yeah.
I mean, pretty good body. I think we talked to an expert in Florida who mentioned there's an argument that you lower the crime rate by keeping these guys locked up so long. But there's another argument that there's a human cost. There's a human capital expense for not having those people out in the community working. Like there's all kinds of studies that show that they age out of criminal behavior, usually by like 40s, 50s, like we talked about in John's story. But there's, keeping them locked up in their income earning years hurts their families, it hurts their communities. I mean, I think somebody asked me on public radio the other day about this, but we're in a worker shortage, right? All these restaurants, all these companies that can't get enough workers. Well, a lot of people are locked up in prison who would like to work. And, if they're not violent criminals or if they turn their life around, that's actually a labor question that economists have studied.
And more than half the people that are currently serving life without parole in Louisiana are between the ages of 40 and 60. And there were 248 people who are between the ages of 70 and 80, and even 41 people who are between the ages of 80 and 90.
Wow.
We got some interesting legal questions. One about Napoleonic code versus common law, which I think is that's an interesting issue. Might be above it's above my pay grade a little bit because I know Louisiana Napoleonic code, but I do think it's important to remember that it's often the legislators who are writing the statutes that the judges have to abide by. So that's an interesting piece of it. It doesn't necessarily matter the Napoleonic code versus common law. What we've seen in Florida, Louisiana, Texas is it's lawmakers who write these laws, and then it's judges who kind of have to live under them. Like the one we talked about in Florida that came from the state senators and lawmakers there. So, the judges sometimes in all states don't have as much power as they'd like to. And then we had somebody asked about racism on juries. And I think that's an interesting question for you, Lea, because Louisiana used to have non-unanimous juries. Can you talk about that?
I can. So until a few years ago, non-unanimous jury verdicts were still allowed in Louisiana. So you could have up to 2 jurors could disagree with the verdict and it would still stand. The legislature changed this recently after a lot of great reporting from The Advocate on how this law had its roots in Jim Crow laws and practices and how it was created to allow for maybe if there were two Black people on a jury, if they disagreed, their opinion wouldn't be factored into the verdict. So yeah, luckily that doesn't exist anymore. And now they're having to go back and look at a lot of cases where a lot of questions about whether this is retroactive, and if so, how will that all play out?
And in Tiffany's case, it didn't apply because she opted to go before a judge. And so the judge actually was the decider in her case. I saw there's a question from someone in the comments, Lea, about the second degree murder law. Can you just explain just real quick about Louisiana's law and why it's so different?
Yes. So Louisiana's second degree murder statute, for one thing, it carries a mandatory life without parole sentence. It's also a very broad statute. So it includes even some accidental deaths, which is what we focused on in this story. If someone dies during the commission of another felony, prosecutors can get them convicted of second degree murder without proving that they intended to harm or kill the victim. So in Tiffany's case, she was convicted of second degree murder because she was found guilty of cruelty to juveniles. And that offense is especially unusual, according to the experts we talked to, because it is a crime of negligence. So when we think of murder, we think of a violent crime. In this case, it was not a violent offense. It was that she was neglectful in not taking her child to the doctor. So yeah, that's what makes the statute unique, is that it contains this very broad definition and carries a mandatory life without parole sentence.
In Florida and Pennsylvania, Louisiana and Pennsylvania are the only ones that have this mandatory life without parole for second degree murder. Other states, the judge would have had more discretion, and you see that a lot of times.
Yep.
Great. Are there other important aspects to this that I haven't asked you guys about?
I think it just raises a lot of questions. I know we've got a lot of folks in the comment section kind of saying, oh, well, what about the victims of the crimes? And I think that's why a lot of the lawmakers and prosecutors we talked about maybe revamping the parole process or relooking at it in states like Louisiana or Florida, because in Oklahoma, where I did a lot of reporting for a lot of years and where I live, they have a parole board. It's a long multi-day process, and they actually hear from victims. The victims are notified every time someone comes up for parole. And if they want to attend and object, they get to come in here and tell them in person and talk about their loss and how this person affected their life. And it really does go into the board's decisions. I've seen them turn people down because of a crime victim's family talking about what happened to them. So I think it's just the idea that you have a system to weigh all those. I've seen other people who didn't kill anybody, who got parole, and they really turned their lives around. So that's what, I think traditionally the role of those boards were. The clemency process, a lot of folks have talked about that, where people can write and, plead with the governor or whatever body it is in their state. So I think those things there's usually a measured way to take that into account, but it's the crime victims are usually thought of. But prosecutors are very, thoughtful about thinking about that. And they really do try to look out for that. And parole boards do. It's tough, when you get rid of these. Someone said they weren't notified. Well, I'm not sure what state you live in, and it kind of depends on the state and their system. There's always problems.
You mentioned that a lot of these laws were written in the 90s. Do you think that some of these concepts, that they just didn't foresee how very many people would end up behind bars because of them?
Yeah, I think when we talked about the legislators write these laws and then the judges and prosecutors, the ones that have to kind of live by those rules, that's where that disconnect happens. Is the lawmakers, they're not the ones running the courts. They're just trying to do things that look good on paper to get reelected a lot of time. So they come up with 3 strikes, you're out was like a catchphrase. It's basically based on like a baseball rule, right? So this is not in criminal justice policy. It's like, oh, that's catchy. It sounds like baseball. 3 strikes, you're out. So that comes from, because these are guys trying to get reelected. It sounds good. There was high crime rates. People were freaking out. You see the executions spike up. The peak for executions was around 99, 2000. So a lot of it was a reaction to very real violent crime that was happening in big cities and in other rural places. So these laws get written, and then, out of fear, sometimes out of very real concerns. And then the courts end up having to deal with it. The prison systems have to deal with it. The people who house and care for the prisoners. The Department of Corrections, they didn't have anything to do with writing these laws. They were just there taking care of them. So it just, it's complicated. I think someone asked me about this on radio the other day in Louisiana on talk radio. And I said, well, this isn't a quick fix. It's not a situation we got into quickly. And it's not anything that we're ever going to get out of quickly. But it is very expensive. It's an expensive system.
Great. Okay. Well, I can't think of anything that we didn't tackle here. Is there anybody have anything else they want to raise?
No, right. Just if somebody wants to ask us questions on Twitter or an email, you can find all of that on our websites, themarshallproject.org, The Advocate, NOLA News. We're all on Twitter. We are happy to answer questions all the time. You can read our articles at themarshallproject.org. And Lea, do you want to say the Advocate's web address?
Theadvocate.com and NOLA.com.
And Illica also shares all of her data. So Illica, tell people how they can see the numbers that you came up with.
Yeah, if you go onto the Marshall Project's website and you're reading the article, at the bottom there's a link for an observable notebook, which can display a bunch of charts and graphs. And in that notebook, you can go ahead and download the data for yourself and take a look at what people are in for, what kinds of charges people have, and their ages and their demographic information. And so it's anonymized, but you can get a lot of insight that way. So.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been really, really fascinating. And we also appreciate the great questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for watching.